Morning, everyone. Welcome to this week's SEMLA Research webinar, where we are glad both to have Guillermo Vuletin from Brookings institution and to be broadcasting this seminar from the Banco Central del Uruguay, where we just finished a meeting that we have here at the bank. And where luckily Guillermo is also in this area visiting, so we'll be able to broadcast this seminar from here. Let me tell you a little bit about Guillermo. Guillermo Vuletin is at the Brookings Institution, Global Economy and Development, Global Series, Economic and Social Policy in Latin American Initiative. That was long. Guillermo is a fellow in that Global Economy and Development Program at that initiative, and also he is a visiting professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He has been a visiting scholar at the World Bank and IDB, and he was an assistant professor at Colby College. Guillermo's research focuses on fiscal and monetary policies with a particular interest in macroeconomic policy in emerging and developing countries. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Maryland, and he's going to tell us about this book or report on reserve requirements in the brave new macroprudential work that was edited, I understand, both by Ceres, Brookings, and the World Bank. So, without further ado, it is my pleasure to receive Guillermo Vuletin. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Alberto. Thank you, SEMLA, and thank you, the Bank of Uruguay, for being such a wonderful host. As you just said, I'm here working with Ceres, with Ernesto Talvi too, and it's wonderful to be able to be here and to be able to present some of our work. This has been, as you mentioned, a joint work with the people at the World Bank, with the LAC office of Augusto de la Torre, and this has been quite a long process. We have been working on this sort of series of papers for about a year and a half or something like that, and this report that it's called Reserve Requirements in the Brave New Macroprudential World, which is quite a strong title, has been somehow an attempt to put all these series of papers together within a certain framework and a certain story. And this has been a joint work with Tito Cordela from the World Bank, back then at the LAC office, Pablo Federico, who is now at BlackRock, Carlos Begg, who was visiting the bank back then, and he's a professor at Hopkins and a fellow at the MBR, and myself. And if by any chance you would like to take a look at the background papers that we have, that are the background of all this report, you can take a look at my newly designed website, guillermovuletin.com. So what is that we're doing this paper? As the paper suggests, we take a look at the macroprudential world. It has been quite a discussion lately. I think to some extent we are sort of converging to agree what this macroprudential world means. But let me contextualize a little bit of how is that we came to think about this report. So if we take a look at the motivation for the report, when you take a look at emerging markets have been typically pursuing procyclical fiscal policy, and this is quite a bit of my background. Typically fiscal stuff. I have been working with Carlos a lot with fiscal cyclicality, with Jeff Frankel, also on some papers about graduation, tax and fiscal multipliers. So coming from this world, we typically think about how is that fiscal policy is conducted and to what extent procyclical fiscal policy amplified business cycle fluctuation, that is to say, is an undesired fiscal policy. So coming from this world, when you take a look at what happens on the monetary side, what is the monetary policy, you also find that particularly developing countries have been pursuing procyclical monetary policy. That is to say, central banks typically tend to increase interest rates in bad times, particularly because bad times are characterized by capital outflows and pressure on exchange rate depreciation. So as a way of dealing with that pressures towards depreciation, central banks increase interest rate to ameliorate that side. But when doing that, if you believe that an increase in interest rate has a potentially harmful effect on the economy, the question is, what do we do about that? Because if you just think through the eyes of the currency defense, then you're hurting the economy, the credit cycle, and so on and so forth, particularly in a bad time. And this is how we started to think about the role of macroprudential. When trying to think about macroprudential, we will see in detail a little bit later, there is quite a disagreement or different takes in the literature in how to think about that. We come with this idea of to what extent central banks in the region and in other emerging markets have been using things such as reserve requirements, capital requirements for stabilization purposes. So to what extent prudential tools have been used for macro stabilization purposes. And we're going to take a look at that, and this was a big part of the report where we basically build a huge data set. I bet that many of the attendees are some of the people that we send emails begging them to help us to trying to collect this data set. So central banks and central bank staff was heavily was heavily involved in all this process, because naturally, differently to interest rates or GDP or government expenditures, you typically don't have that kind of worldwide data set coming from the IMF or from the IFS. You just don't download this kind of data set. So a big challenge and a big part of the efforts in this group, in this project, was to gather an important, comprehensive data set, particularly on reserve requirements, which will become quite clear in a couple of minutes why is that we did that. And once we have a take on that, we also took a look at the role of foreign exchange market intervention, because when thinking about what are the tools that typically central banks have, of course you have monetary policy, you also have some of these prudential instruments, but you also have foreign exchange market intervention as a way of dealing with capital inflows and outflows. That depending on how much relevant you think they are, if you talk to someone like Ernesto Talvi or like Alejandro Izquierdo in some of their papers, they show that about 50-60% of output volatility in emerging markets are driven by external conditions. So to the extent that one articulates that in that way, then we have to think in terms of how is that emerging market respond to that kind of capital flows movement that are typically driven by external factors. And after taking a look at that, we are going to take a look at other possible instruments, in particular in terms of capital controls and fiscal policy, how is that they fit in this picture. And lastly, we're going to take a look at policy implications and what is that central banks are doing and how is that our story helps articulate what they're effectively doing. Okay. So this is one of the tables that is quite famous. It started with a paper with Carmen Reinhardt and Graciela Kaminsky and Carlos Vega on fiscal procyclicality. For those of you who are fans of soccer, this is a so-called Peñarol plot, because the colors are the ones that are related to this team in Uruguay that is black and yellow. So what you have here is basically, and without making any super attempt of establishing a causality, even though there are more refined studies that show that these pictures resemble the causality, what this picture ends up capturing is the correlation between the cyclical component of government expenditure and GDP. Where positive bars means that you spend more in good times and spend less in bad times, and negative bars, so that's a procyclical behavior. And if you take a look at the negative side, the bottom side of this plot, it shows negative correlations, which means basically that in good times you tend to spend less than usual, and in bad times you tend to spend more than usual. So that's the contracyclical fiscal policy behavior. And when you take a look at the historical pattern, it's overwhelming the evidence that the black bars that are industrial countries behave contracyclically, and that the procyclical behavior is mostly associated with the developing world. We have a paper with Carlos and Jeff where we show that there is some graduation, and emerging markets have been learning in terms of macroprudential, in terms of macroeconomic stability, and have been using fiscal policy in a more contracyclical manner. But overall speaking, if you take a look at the history of the region and what may happen in the region, depending on who you talk to in the 2, 3, 5 years to come, in terms of the debt sustainability and things like that, most people tend to agree that fiscal policy has been procyclical in emerging markets and contracyclical in industrial countries. And naturally, there are another set of many papers that articulate that procyclical fiscal policy tend to amplify the cycle precisely because you spend more in good times, amplifying the boom, and when you're in the bust, you reduce government expenditure, amplifying the bust, so that doesn't help in terms of macroeconomic stability. So with that background in mind, with that sort of fiscal influence, if I may, the next slide, and what we started to do next, and this was part of a paper that we did for the Chicago Fed, is we took a look at, there we go, what happens when you take a look at monetary policy. Do we observe similar behavior in terms of the pro and contra cyclicality? And what you typically observe, and again, this is an historical average, again, many central banks in the region especially have evolved a lot, and they have been able to graduate from procyclicality. But if you take a look at the historical pattern, what you observe again is that advanced economies, the black bars, have positive correlations typically, meaning in good times you increase the interest rate to sort of cool off the economy, and in bad times you reduce interest rate to stimulate the credit cycle and economic growth. So they have been behaving counter-cyclically. And if you take a look at the developing country, it doesn't come as a striking picture as the previous one in terms of fiscal policy, but at least one could argue that on average, emerging markets do not behave in a counter-cyclical manner. And depending which country you are, which time of the sample period you take, whether you are in crisis mode or not, things change a little. But there are many countries, particularly big countries. You have Mexico, you have Argentina, you have Chile, you have Uruguay, that have been, historically speaking, behaving procyclically. And once we internalize that, the question is, why do we have why is that monetary policy is procyclical in emerging markets? And the typical answer, and this comes very common when you talk to policymakers, and it's a very established fact, if I may, is that a prototypical emerging market during crisis, during huge recessions, particularly if they are driven by capital outflows, what you get is a very steep pressures towards depreciation of the currency. Typically, countries do not want their exchange rate to depreciate 20, 30, 50% in a couple of days. So in order to defend the currency, what they do is they increase interest rates. And that behavior means that during a bad time, you're increasing interest rates, which is a procyclical behavior. If one believes that those increasing interest rates will have a harmful effect on the credit cycle and on the economy. But why is that still, knowing that, central banks do that, is because when dealing with this tension between output stabilization purposes and exchange rate defense, it seems that, at least from a preference, the real preference point of view, they prefer to focus on the defense of the currency. And this is nice, very nicely, if we can articulate this in terms of a typical Taylor rule, not the typical Taylor rule for a closed economy, where you would just only have the first two terms on the right-hand side. This is a typical closed economy US kind of Taylor rule. But if you think, as Eduardo Moron would say, in terms of an extended Taylor rule that also includes the role of exchange rate, what happens is that during a crisis, during a recession that is motivated with capital outflows, what you have is these two tensions, this dilemma. On one hand, the lower output, the negative gap on the first term calls for lower interest rate to stimulate the economy and to work in a contracyclical manner. But at the same time, because you have a rapid pressure towards depreciation in the currency, what that calls is for higher interest rate defense. So that is the kind of tension that we emerging markets have, and it's very peculiar to us. And if you take a look also at the historical analysis, typically, I would say particularly in the 70s and in the 80s, what you have is that output and inflation are negatively related, in the sense that what you have is that huge economic crises driven by large depreciations are associated with high levels of inflation. Typically, the crisis mode kind of inflation we have in emerging markets is not the Keynesian kind of inflation that is driven by increasing output and pressures and overheating pressures towards higher inflation, but rather the one that is associated with huge currency devaluations. And this is something that industrial countries do not have, because industrial countries typically are not that sensitive of huge movements in capital flows, in huge movements in exchange rates, and typically inflation and output tends to move with in the same direction. So in that sense, you have two targets, output gap and inflation gap in advanced economies, only one instrument, but because these two targets are positively related, you have one stone that could deal with two problems. That is the kind of dilemma and tension that you have in emerging markets, that these two things are not moving together. This Taylor rule, the expanded Taylor rule, are putting pressure in two different dimensions. So, if you agree with me on that, you would also agree that this is not something new, this kind of monetary policy behavior. For example, in the 1997 Asian crisis, Stanley Fischer, at the time first deputy managing director at the IMF, said, in weighting the question of whether the programs were too tough, it is important to recall that they approached the IMF, the reserves of Thailand and Korea were previously low, and the Indonesian rupiah was excessively depreciated, that the first order of business was, and still is, to restore confidence in the currency. To achieve this, countries have to make it more attractive to hold domestic currency, which in turn requires increasing interest rate temporarily, even if higher interest costs complicate the situation of weak banks and corporations. So even from the IMF at the time, it was clear that there was this acknowledgement of its tension, and if something, they were pushing the idea that interest rate policy should be more concerned about maintaining the value of the currency, because if that goes out there in the clouds and it explodes, then we have an order of magnitude of problems that are much more complicated than the ones we could have by increasing interest rate and having some effect on banks and corporations. And I just see Nicolas Amoroso has a question. Hi Nicolas, great to meet you. Great to see you again. Should you add the indirect channels of pass-through to inflation? Yes, here this is a very simple, I completely agree with you. This is a very simple way of describing some stylized facts. In some other papers where we are more high-tech in terms of introducing some other channels and going a little bit beyond in terms of endogeneity concerns, we address some of these issues. The problem is that in this multidimensional problem, sometimes we have preferred, particularly in this first part of the presentation, which is based on a paper that mainly shows basic stylized facts, just to show some basic pictures that resonates with the kind of ideas people had in mind. But you're absolutely correct. Everything has to do with everything, so it is tough to articulate all the channels that could go through. You also have, for example, what is the extent of liability dollarization you have in the system. This could also play a role. There are many variables that could amplify or not some of the channels we talk about. But you're absolutely right. This is, at best, some preliminary evidence of what is going on. I hope that more or less answers your question. Thank you. And when you take a look at what happens nowadays, what is that central bankers thinking and saying these days, the story is more or less the same. If you take a look at the Financial Times, the central bank governor Alexandre Tomboni, on dealing with depreciation early this year, on pressures on depreciations, the Financial Times says the Brazilian response has been very classic: tightening monetary policy, increasing interest rates, using foreign reserves as buffers. So here we can see already the kind of story we are building during a tough capital outflow pressures because of increasing interest rates in the States. What central banks are doing are increasing interest rate and using selling reserves to ameliorate the effect on currency depreciations. Other countries will have to follow suit. They will have to do the same. Some may be reluctant, but at the end of the day, what happens is that the vacuum cleaner of rising interest rate in the developed world would suck out money from emerging markets and force other central banks to tighten monetary policy too. So again, this is in the same thing of how central banks tend to think about monetary policy, particularly in stressful times. And Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, India, with different combinations of currency depreciation, foreign exchange rate intervention, and interest rate depreciations, they have also used that. And Raghu Rajan also, at the very beginning of the year, when increasing interest rate to combat inflation and the weak currency, he said exactly the same. We have decided to focus on getting macroeconomic stability on India, the rest will follow. So somehow, our take on all this is, it's clearly that the focus of central banks have been on how to deal with currency depreciations, and somehow we're not going to use interest rate policy for the usual policy that you would do following a basic Taylor rule. Here, Arnulfo asked another. Oscar Raban. Okay. He said the other issue why you have the currency crisis to start with means that it's related with previous monetary policy. Starting conditions are important. I couldn't agree with you more. And so far, in terms of this presentation, we haven't talked about fiscal policy, we haven't talked about the sustainability, we haven't talked about how much buffers you have in terms of reserves. And clearly, all these variables are important, because if you don't have, I fully agree with you, if you don't have good initial conditions, then your degree of maneuver, your fiscal or monetary readiness is going to be quite small, so you will not have the chance of using interest rate. And this is related to, I guess, this great point is to two things. One is to what extent some countries in the region have been able to mature in terms of building huge buffers of reserves, such that either by using them or by using them as a signaling strategy gives a little bit more flexibility to the use of interest rates for currency defense, because if you have a pile in stock of reserves, then you might not need to be that aggressive in terms of monetary policy, because you could rely more on selling reserves. And the other one is related to the fiscal side, right? Because if we have a nice fiscal strategy in terms of having short-term flexibility, that is to say, being countercyclically, but maintaining the house in order in terms of not having exploding debts, then that will not create the kind of pressures we're used to in terms of pressures to depreciation. So absolutely, I agree that initial conditions matters a lot, and this is in fact one of the strategies we pursued in a paper that we did for the last year IMF annual research conference, where we tried to link initial conditions on the monetary space, initial conditions on the fiscal space, to fiscal and monetary behavior in terms of the procyclicality and contracyclicality. And then in a further paper that comes out of that, for a meeting with the G20, we articulate how is that procyclical or contracyclical policy actually relates with social indicators that one would care about, such as riots, inequalities, unemployment, and things like that. So it sort of completes the whole idea of initial conditions matter for policy behavior, which matter for social implications. So I fully agree with you. The initial conditions matters a lot. And this is actually where we're going to move in 1 second. My pleasure. Thank you. So precisely what is at the core of this monetary policy procyclicality, well, this is a term that, conceptually speaking, is not new. Of course, we have to put fancy titles to try to be catchy. And what we did in that paper of graduation of monetary policy for the Chicago Fed and the ECB was to articulate the concept of fear of free falling. And this is a quite well-known but quite well-known concept, in which basically what we try to do is we try to articulate how is that if we can establish a regularity between changes in interest rates with changes in exchange rate, to the extent that you have a high correlation between the cyclical component of a policy interest rate, short-term policy interest rate, with the rate of depreciation, that is suggesting, of course, with all the endogeneity caveats, that monetary policy is being used for exchange rate defense. So what we do is we calculate this correlation, and we call this the idea of fear of free falling. It's precisely the idea that central banks are intervening in interest rate policy to defend the exchange rate. And what we do then is to correlate that with the monetary procyclicality. And we're going to present that with some simple graph, but the same stuff is what you get if you use more elaborated Taylor rule, or if you do some impulse response function with some interaction term using Hoda or something like that. And basically, what you get is this kind of picture when trying to take a look at this determinant, what are some of the determinants of this procyclical monetary policy. What you have in this figure is, I hope that you can read. It was not my attempt to pass without any sort of comment, but if you take a look at the x-axis, we have this measure of the fear of free fall in this correlation between the cyclical component of interest rate and currency depreciation, and on the y-axis you have the correlation between the cycle of interest rate and the cycle of real GDP. So basically the y-hand side, the y-axis represent the pro or contra cyclicality of monetary policy. On the positive side being contra-cyclical, on the negative side being pro-cyclical. And once you compare these two measures, what you see, again, I know there is a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of uncertainty, they're not super nicely alienated across this trend, but on average what you see is a negative relationship, which seems to suggest that when your fear of free falling is very, very low, is going on the left-hand side, then you are able to pursue more contra-cyclical monetary policy, and when you move towards the right of this plot, your fear of free falling is high, your intervention is more associated with currency defense, and that implies, because of the typical relationship between exchange rate depreciations and output cycle, that you typically behave in a procyclical way. So this somehow tries to put in a more articulated way the argument we were doing before, the argument that monetary policy, at least in many emerging markets, are driven by this so-called fear of free falling, which is particularly what many countries are graduating nowadays as they build more buffers through foreign reserves and as they gain credibility in their central banks in terms of central bank independence and depending on who you talk to, which country we're talking about. The other thing that it naturally comes from this kind of analysis is that if you take a look at a measure such as institutional quality, which I know has many problems, it's a measure that basically does something like this and articulates whether things are going right or wrong in these countries. I know it's a very endogenous measure, but still, you see that the fear of free falling is quite related with institutional quality, in the sense that high institutional quality is associated with lower fear of free falling. And this institutional quality may be captured in a broad sense, things such as debt sustainability, quality of bureaucracy, maybe capturing a bunch of things that are going around, but it tells you a lot in terms of how this fear of free falling is associated with well-behaved countries in terms of overall institutional quality. So once we have this very pessimistic idea of not pessimistic, but this idea of how emerging markets work, if you buy this, what we did then, and this was very nice, to learn is that what we separate was the cyclical behavior of monetary policy before and after, and before and after 2000. Why? Because when taking a look at the data, when taking a look at major events in the region, it seems that somehow the late 90s and early 2000s has been like a breaking point where the region has been able to, and many other countries, have been able to mature in terms of fiscal management, in terms of monetary policy. So what we present here, in a hopefully very catchy way, is to picture the idea of to what extent countries have been able to graduate, to what extent countries have been able to move away from a procyclical behavior towards a more contracyclical behavior. And what we have is this before capturing the x-axis and the after capturing the y-axis. And what you take out of this is that you have these four regions. The still in a school region on the lower left-hand side is a region of those countries. Each point is an average behavior of a country during that period. So I know that there are many different stories of what happened between the 1960 and 2000 in these countries. We're just averaging the behavior of countries. Still in school are those countries that used to be procyclical and are still procyclical. The good news is that if you take a look at the dots there are not that many, so that's good news. The other group of countries, if you go to the opposite quadrant, if you go to the top right-hand side, is established graduates. Those countries that were contracyclical in terms of monetary policy before and are still contracyclical nowadays. And not surprisingly, you have most of the advanced world there. You have the United States, you have the UK, you have Colombia, you have South Africa, you have Peru. Some of these things are naturally borderline and they're not articulated through the eyes of standard errors or things like that, just to give a picture of what is happening, just to give a brief idea of what is happening. And the good news is that if you take a look at the other quadrant, the recent graduate quadrant, the left-hand side upper part of this figure, what you have is dots of those countries that used to be procyclical and nowadays, at least since 2002 until 2009, which is subject to be extended to see what happens, have switched teams going from a procyclical group towards a contracyclical group. And they are one of the countries that come as a poster child, if I may, of that kind of graduation. If Chile, if you take a look at Chile in their history before 1980s, they have quite, 1990s, they have quite a turbulent times, and how is that they were willing to deal with many, many crises. But if you take a look at their behavior nowadays, it's very classic behavior of contracyclical countries. So this gives you a sense of why is that we think that monetary policy has been procyclical, to what extent there has been a graduation process of many countries, particularly nowadays, now that you are able to have larger buffers of reserves, and now that on the fiscal side many countries have improved, so you don't have the pressure of huge debt crisis, huge financial crisis. So to the extent that the region has been able to improve on their macro management, not necessarily on their development side, but yes, on the macro management side, what we are having is that monetary policy has been more frequently used in a regular contracyclical manner. So with this picture in mind, motivating from fiscal, going through monetary, the paper or the report tackles the issue of macroprudential policy. And this is where we might start to have huge disagreements on what macroprudential policy is and how is that we measure it and so on and so forth. But hopefully this will create a nice discussion. So when we started to think about macroprudential, the first question is, what is macroprudential? You ask different people around and they come with different answers. Some people are more concerned about systemic risk and financial stability concern. Some other people are thinking in terms of what is that you do with the credit cycle, because you care about the credit cycle and how that affects the output cycle. So it's a difficult monster. And I think even though each of us, I think, tend to have a very clear definition, I think we typically don't agree. And if something the literature is still trying to figure out and is trying to create a consensus, yet I don't think that there is a growing emerging consensus of what it is. I think we're still trying to learn how to define things. But I think that let me at least put some idea out there to see how is that we thought about this. So what is macroprudential policy? Is a use of typical prudential instruments such as reserve requirements, loan-to-value ratios, taxes on credit, and capital requirements. I may add here the dynamic provisioning that the people at the Bank of Spain have. And typically, they are used for business, to smooth the credit cycle and avert major crises. And when you think about this very broad definition, the way in which people have rationalized and articulated this broad definition comes in two flavors. One group of people, particularly in academic circles and international financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, BIS, and so on and so forth, they typically think of macroprudential policy through the eyes of the buildup of systemic risk and financial stability concern. And this is how many of the theoretical advances have been made. A couple of weeks ago, Anton Korinek presented here at Sembla, and he comes with this background. He comes with how to think about macroprudential policy through the eyes of financial stability. When you talk to, or at least my take is, when you talk to policymakers in the region, they have this view, particularly on the finance side, but typically what they tend to think about is to what extent you can use prudential regulation that affects the credit market for macroeconomic stabilization purposes, in the presence of large capital flows, to a large extent driven by external factor, decreases in interest rates first, and now the tapering, how to deal with that. And it's mostly driven by the desire to stabilize the exchange rate and the credit cycle. Of course, these two things are related, right? Because if you have important buildup of systemic risk and high financial instability, it's quite likely that your business cycle will tend to be amplified. Now, the precise link between these two kind of concepts is not an easy job. It's not easy to translate from this world to this world. And actually, in the report, we have a view, we have some suggestions, but it's still, I think, a place where we clearly need to keep doing a lot of research. But in practice, when you try to come up with a way of measuring all this stuff, the distinction between these two views, the systemic risk and financial stability concerns vis-a-vis the business cycle driven, is not so clear. Because, of course, if you have large credit cycles booms, large credit cycle outputs, typical associated with huge capital inflows, it's quite likely that you will develop build-up of some systemic risk, and this will translate later on in terms of financial instability. So I know that from a conceptual point of view, it's a fairly easy distinction to make, but when you try to move from theory or from concepts to empirics, it is a tough one. And what we decided then, when thinking about how to push this project on macroprudential policy, is to continue our view of what we think many policymakers in the regions are doing, which is typically be concerned about huge output fluctuations, huge credit cycle fluctuations, and that is why we're going to relate macroprudential policy, particularly reserve requirements, with output cycle. So we're going to take a look at output cycle as somehow a way of of articulating the second flavor, the second view, the policymaker's view, and maybe argue that this is related also with the first view. The proof is in the pudding, more research is needed to be done to differentiate those kind of motives. And we're going to take a look at reserve requirements, even though there are a super rich number of instruments out there as capital requirements, dynamic provisioning, because what we are trying to do here is two things. The first one is finish a paper. So we wanted to have something that is doable in the sense of being able to collect data for many countries, as many as possible, and long time series, to see to what extent the role of macroprudential policy has changed over time. Because what happens is, nowadays, in most central banks and in many academic circles, everybody talks as macroprudential as if this was something new, but this is not something new. Maybe the term macroprudential policy is a little bit of a fashionable word nowadays, but this has been going on for many, many years. If you take a look at the old taxation on capital, at the end of the day, that could be rationalized through the eyes of a macroprudential policy. So it's not something that is new. So what we are trying to do is to truly get a broad sense of what's going on in the last 70 years. So this was a big part of our efforts. So what is that we did in this paper? In the first paper, this was a hell of a work, and the office of Augusto de la Torre at the World Bank was ridiculously good in pushing all these efforts. What we did was to collect data on reserve requirements for 52 countries, 37 emerging and 15 industrials, starting in 1970 to the present, at a quarterly frequency, because that's very important, particularly if you want to do import response function and things like that. Getting annual data is not going to be a good idea. In terms of the sources, the reserve requirements, we send emails to many people in central banks, super great professionals and great Samaritans that were able to help us in this project. We also looked at IMF reports, and in terms of interest rates, GDP, and international reserves, this was more of an easier task, which is we got data from the IFS, global financial data, and national sources. But the reserve requirement is clearly the key part of our project, and it took us basically 5, 7, 8 months just to put something together so we can start playing around. So this was quite of an effort in that sense. So what is that we got? Well, one of the things we learned first, even though we knew, but this table sort of articulates this, is that reserve requirements come in a variety of ways. So here what we did was to separate reserve requirements in this table in two dimensions. One is whether you are a developing country or an industrial country, and then whether you have reserve requirements that vary across different dimensions. So the first column is single reserve requirements. There are many countries with some caveats, depending on the time span, that have a single reserve requirements for all type of deposits in dollars, in foreign currency, different type of maturity structure. There are many others that have reserve requirements varying across maturities, typically higher reserve requirements for shorter side deposits. In the region, we are very dollarized, and many other countries in Eastern Europe, so it's not surprising that reserve requirements varies across the currency, whether it's local or foreign currency. Typically, you would have higher reserve requirements for foreign currency to try to ameliorate and reduce the pressures of liability dollarizations and any kind of maturity mismatch that you could have in the financial system. And then you have other countries, some of them that doesn't come as a surprise, Argentina, Turkey, Uruguay, where you have reserve requirements varying across both dimensions, the maturity and the currency reserve requirements. Marco Vega just asked, did you consider marginal reserve requirements, average, or both? That's a great point, because when getting into this world, we thought, fiscal policy, we have to deal with that, government expenditure, tax rate, it's just a marginal one. When we got into this, we got, is it marginal, is it average? So one thing that is important is, before going to your question, is these are legal reserve requirements. These are not de facto reserves over deposits ratio. Why? Because we wanted to take a look at the policy instrument as opposed to an endogenous variable like revenues on the fiscal side. So that's one on the variable itself. Now, going back to the question of a marginal or average, we typically try to use the marginal one. I know that in some countries that creates a problem, because what you have is that during some periods of time, the marginal reserve might go up to 100, while the average is still lower because the margin that applies to existing deposit was lower. So it was a tough call. We decided to go with the marginal because we thought that with the caveat of those extreme cases where the marginal deposit might go ridiculously high sometimes, it captures the extent to which the new policy could affect the economy or new developments in the credit. And in many, many cases, the marginal and the average coincided. But I fully agree with you. I think that there are some places where something else should be done, and we're working on this. We keep working on this project. This is a comment that we get a lot, and one day we sort of fully agree that the marginal one is the way to go, and some other days we say, well, maybe the average, if you want to calculate the average impact of this on this. But somehow we got convinced ourselves, subject to be changed 100%, that the marginal was a better way of capturing that. Alberto, this just a comment related to your comment that many things will be categorized in the umbrella of macroprudential policy. Each policy, macroprudential or plain macroeconomic, must be evaluated on its own, looking at their effects on the aim target, the externality of any policy could cause outside aim target. Absolutely. In the paper, in the first paper, which is what I'm already showing you, that I'm still showing you, we did some basic stylized facts. In the second paper, where we use a narrative approach to identify exogenous and endogenous changes in reserve requirements, a la Romer on the fiscal side, and we went a little bit more in that direction, trying to see how is that monetary reserve requirements policy affect interest rate spreads, how is that they affect the credit cycle, how is that they affect output, how is that they affect the currency depreciation. We try to go a little bit towards the transmission mechanism and try to understand the effect on the target and then the effect on some other more general equilibrium variables. But this is still a work in progress. What we learn about all this is that there are many, many people in central banks, the BIS, that are doing a lot of super neat work in terms of, let's take a look at the experience of this country in this particular variable and the effect it has on credit or things like that. And it's fantastic because you truly have a great understanding of what is going on in that country. What we try to do here is to try to zoom out and see if we can get some empirical regularity in a way that one could talk about challenges of emerging markets, challenges of Latin American countries. And of course, when doing that zoom out process, then we lose the detail. But the good thing is that hopefully with this data set, we will be able to go nuts in some other dimensions that refers both to the target as well as to the other variables that might affect through externalities. I fully agree with you. I think it's something I take this opportunity of presenting this at SEMLA as something like, let's talk, let's have ideas, let's put some data out there. I'm pretty sure we might have, we did the best we could in terms of putting data set together, but I'm pretty sure this will be a process of many, many feedback, and that's why this opportunity of talking with central bankers and people working at the central bank is fantastic. But I fully agree with you. One issue that I have to mention here is that even though for those countries that have different levels of reserve requirements and different type of reserve requirements, they have different levels naturally. One thing that you typically see is that the trend of all these different reserve requirements tends to go hand in hand. So if you take a look at the correlation among different type of reserve requirements, say in the case of Argentina that has maturity and currency reserve requirements, if you take a look at the simple quarter correlation between the changes in these reserve requirements, it's pretty high. So even though in some cases, some countries use one type of reserve requirement, they increase the requirement on foreign currency to try to increase the solvency, not the solvency, but the exposure of the banking system. Most of the time, these reserve requirements, overall speaking, tend to move quite hand in hand. And that's why at the end of the day, when working with some basic stylized facts that I'm going to show you starting now, what we did was to use the average reserve requirement, the unweighted average reserve requirement, which I know is not ideal because in principle one would like to have a weighted reserve requirement, somehow weighting the reserve requirements depending on the importance of the deposit or some other variable that help us to encompass the relative importance of different kinds of deposits. We didn't have at the time that kind of data set, and it would be great to have it and just keep moving this forward. So one thing that happens with reserve requirement policy that is quite different to interest rate policy or fiscal policy, and on the spending side particularly, is that reserve requirements do not change every day. Reserve requirements somehow behaves more similar to tax rates. Every now and then, every 1 year, 2 quarters, 5 years, they change. And that matters a lot because the type of policy analysis that you do of a variable that changes quite infrequently is very different from the one that you could do when you have a series such as interest rate policy or government expenditure. So we would have to, we were sort of going back and forth in how is that we could articulate the importance of reserve requirement policy in terms of macroeconomic stabilization purposes. Because if the reserve requirement changes, say, once every 20 years, and the frequency and the cycle is of one country is, say, 5 years or 3 years, then it's quite unlikely that you would think that reserve requirement policy, that prudential instrument policies has been used for macroprudential purposes stabilization. So we have to create a way of artificially, but with a concept behind, with an idea behind, to articulate how important is the use of macroprudential policy, in this case only reserve requirements, for macroeconomic stabilization purposes. So what we did to try to get into that dimension, to articulate the relevance of this policy for business cycle fluctuation purposes, is to take a look at the frequency of changes in reserve requirements. So what this plot shows is how frequently countries changes their reserve requirements in the whole history of the reserve requirements. And then we did that for different subsamples, but this is just the overall image of the entire period. And what you see, and this is not surprising, is that the yellow bars, emerging markets, tend to change reserve requirements quite often. So here, for example, this is the quarterly frequency of changes in reserve requirement. So if the size of this bar is 1, it means that you change that every quarter. If it is 0.5, you change that every 2 quarters. So if you take a look at, going back to our Peñarol plot, the yellow and black bars, if you take a look at that, what you see is that most of the black bars, most of the advanced world, they don't change reserve requirements quite often. Moreover, in many cases, they don't change that at all. And if you take a look at what is happening on the emerging markets, again, this is an historical average, they change it quite often. In some cases, every 2-3 quarters. And typically, what we're trying to push here is the idea that this is a signaling of how the reserve requirements policy have been articulated differently in the advanced and developing country world, particularly in developing countries, for macroeconomic stabilization purposes. So what we are going to do with this frequency of changes in reserve requirements is to compare that frequency, average frequency, with how large are on average business cycle. So if somehow you change your reserve requirements too often, that is for us a way of thinking, well, this country has been using reserve requirements for macroprudential policy. If that doesn't happen, say the case of Australia, that never changed the reserve requirements in our sample period, this would be captured as, well, this is a country that may have changes in reserve requirements, in this case, no, but even if it happened once, it didn't occur because of macroeconomic stabilization purposes. Because if you wanted to use that for macroeconomic stabilization purposes, you would need to change the reserve requirement more often, at least within one business cycle, at least once. So what we did as a super arbitrary yet conceptually based strategy is to differentiate countries between those that are active and passive in the use of reserve requirements policy, where active are the ones that are associated, potentially speaking, with the use of reserve requirements for macroeconomic stabilization purposes. Sorry, Marco Vega just asked, sorry, do you measure counts frequency on the y-axis and then normalize? So let me go back. No, this is just a measure of the frequency. So yes, it's on the y-axis. What we measure is the frequency of changes in reserve requirements. It's not normalized because it can have a maximum value of, well, in principle not. It could have a value of 10 if they change 10 times the reserve requirements in 1 quarter.
So you count all and then you divide by the number of quarters.
Correct. So thank you very much, Alberto.
He didn't hear me.
Alberto just pointed out super good hint point. Yes, what we did was to calculate changes in frequency of reserve requirements, count them, and then divide that by the number of quarters we have. So this is the average frequency of changes in reserve requirements. Yes. So we didn't do a normalization, but the data shows that countries on average do not change the reserve requirements, say, the case of India, the case of Andorra, quite often, but still it's never 10 times in 1 quarter or something like that. So it's not normalized in that sense. I hope that answers the question of Marco. So when thinking about this passive and active reserve requirements policy, again, it's a very arbitrary measure, but we wanted to take a look at, if we want to characterize countries as having macroprudential policy, and we relate that to business cycle fluctuations to avoid business too much volatility in the output cycle, then we have to come with an operational way of differentiating those countries that use prudential policy for prudential reasons from those that are using prudential policy for macro stabilization purposes. And this came as a natural way of thinking. There might be others. So basically what we did is to take a look at the average frequency of changes in reserve requirements, and if the average frequency of reserve requirements occur more frequently than the business cycle, then we measure that as active, and we use one standard deviation just so we are not that strict we can also introduce the role of history and how that may have changed within time. Here, Arnulfo has another comment. Oscar Cavallo Sembla, Oscar Cavallo, okay? Don't countries also use reserve requirements as a way of defending the currency, drain resources from banks as well to? Yes, I absolutely agree, and this is what we are going to do later. What we did in our second paper was to do a bunch of impulse response functions trying to understand 2 things. The first one is, how is that reserve requirements that are endogenous to business cycle fluctuations respond to business cycle fluctuation purposes, to learn what is the reaction function of a typical policymaker, and then we use the exogenous, what we call the exogenous changes in reserve requirements, that are reserve requirements that are driven not by business cycle considerations, but because of micro purposes such as solvency of the banking system, financial liberalization reforms that are associated with long-term growth and not business cycle purposes. We took all those varieties of changes and we use them, we classify them as exogenous, and once you classify them as exogenous, then you can see what is the implication of those changes in the economy, including the exchange rate. So basically, in our second paper, what we did was a strategy to try to separate endogenous from exogenous, so we can use the exogenous ones to learn the implications of reserve requirement policy, and then the endogenous ones to understand the reaction function of a typical policymaker, as opposed to consider all of them to use impulse response functions and then play around with the orders of the impulse response functions to understand the implications and the reaction function at the same time. We thought that strategy was clear, but you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, everything is a general equilibrium problem where you have several tools. Basically, when you have an exogenous shock of capital outflows, Either you play around with interest rate, you allow the exchange rate to depreciate, you use foreign currency, foreign reserves to defend the currency, or you use reserve requirements. So to that extent, reserve requirements in principle is part of that package. So you're absolutely correct. Okay. And based on this criterion of active versus passive reserve requirements policy, again, historically speaking, we get that about 68% of developing countries have been active, and this is not surprisingly given the graph we just showed before, that most of the yellow bars are on the right-hand side with high numbers. And historically speaking, 33% of industrial countries have been active, and none of them have been active since 2004. I know that many central banks in advanced countries have been working with other kind of macroprudential policy. The case of Spain with dynamic provisioning comes to my mind, but through the eyes of reserve requirements, they have not. At least until 2009, which was the end of the example. So here, there's another comment, but then the typical developing country policy would raise both interest rates and reserve requirements. Well, that is what we are going to find that it doesn't happen. Because to the extent, in principle it could. And if that happened, if you increase interest rates at the same time you increase reserve requirements, then what one may argue is that these two policy tools are used as complements, in the sense that they're both trying to reinforce each other. You increase interest rates, you cool off the credit market, and then you increase reserve requirements, and you also increase the interest rate spreads, and you also attempt to cool off the economy and cool off the credit cycle. What we find is that central banks typically work differently. What they do is they increase interest rates in bad times to defend the currency, but at the same time, and the channel to be understood is still a pending subject, they reduce reserve requirements in an attempt to ameliorate the effect that has on the credit cycle and on output cycle by consequence. So this is where the phrase, it applies in practice, but how about in theory, comes to my mind. Here, I think if you tend to agree, and we'll see, I mean, again, this is still a lot of work in progress. If you buy the idea that this is how developing countries work, we still have to find out what is the transmission mechanism. Because I agree with you that in principle, if we put all together, it might seem contradicting to increase interest rates at the same time. You reduce reserve requirements. So there has to be some wedge, there has to be some friction out there that makes this optimal from a policymaker point of view. We're still trying to understand that, I think. Rafael from Brazil, he asks, please, can you elaborate a little bit more on the difference between business and credit cycle? Yes, great. So when talking about business cycle, we just take a look at real GDP, we apply some plain vanilla HP filter, and we calculate the cyclical component of real GDP. In our view, and it might be a limited view through the eyes of a central banker, when thinking about credit cycles, the only thing we do is to take a look at the credit, the amount of credit that is out there in the financial system. We calculate the cyclical component of that, and we just take a look at that. And if you take a look at developing countries, most of the time, you have this very nice sequence of correlations where the output, the business cycle, or the cyclical component of output flows are super related with the cyclical properties of credit cycle. Basically, when you have a huge capital inflow, you have typically increasing the credit. And as a consequence of that, to the extent that you have a more or less normal economy, where credit matters for growth and lending and so on and so forth, that also translates into a positive cycle of output. So all these three things are linked. The first one, the capital flows credit, through the eyes of how important it is foreign factors and external conditions in the development of the financial system in our countries. And the second one, from credit to output, in terms of basic transmission mechanism from the financial sector to output growth. So that's what we do, and that's why sometimes I talk indifferently about these things, but I should be more explicit about that. Most of this work has been through the eyes of business cycle, and then we check with credit cycles, and it's basically the same because they're typically super correlated to each other. I hope this answers the question. Thank you. So what we did after that was to take a look at this cyclicality of reserve requirement policy. So what we did here, remember, is we have all these countries have reserve requirements. We differentiate between active and passives, and the passives one, we put them in the trash because they're not using reserve requirements policy that frequently, allegedly, for business cycle considerations. And within the countries that remain as actives, what we do is we calculate the correlation between the cyclical component of output and the cyclical component of reserve requirements. And we try with different filters using the cyclical component and then we also use the growth rates because in variables that are not continuous and they look like steps, the use of a regular filter is sort of not a good idea. So we play with different strategies and basically we get the same picture. What we do is, not surprisingly again, most of the bars here are yellow bars. We have few black bars, historically speaking. And most of the bars, the yellow bars, are positive. So what this would indicate, and I apologize, if you take a look at the next picture, which is instead of the whole sample period, you take a look at the 2005-2011, which is the last part of our data set. You have no industrial countries whatsoever. You have many developing countries, and those developing countries, the bars are super positive. What that means is that in good times, you tend to increase reserve requirements, and in bad times, you reduce reserve requirements. So in that sense, reserve requirements are not complementing, are not reinforcing the typical movement you would do with interest rates, which is to increase interest rates, but rather they go down. And that comes to our, I think, okay, no, before going there, sorry. So what we find here is that macroprudential policy has been used in a contra-cyclical manner. If we believe, and I will show you evidence later, that reserve requirements, increases in reserve requirements have the same impact as increases in interest rates, what we find is that countries tend to increase reserve requirements in good times and reduce them in bad times. And this is somehow, we will talk later in terms of the substitution role of reserve requirement policy vis-a-vis the monetary policy. What this tends to show is that if those countries that are using reserve requirement in an active way are contracyclical, and at the same time they are the ones that are using interest rates in a procyclical way, what this is showing, or what this is suggesting, because we didn't get to fancy identification techniques, is that reserve requirement policy is doing what you do not do with interest rate policies. Why? Because you have interest rate policy captured by exchange rate defense. In other words, in a world where you have two targets, output and exchange rate depreciations, and in a world where these two targets do not move positively but negatively, because the depreciation usually is associated with the bad times, you have two targets, and if you have interest rates, you have only one instrument. So you are missing one instrument to deal with two targets that are not correlated with each other. So what we are suggesting, or what this evidence seems to suggest, to the extent that you buy this picture, is that reserve requirement is substituting the role of interest rate policy and is trying to ameliorate what you are doing with interest rate policy because of exchange rate defense. Okay? And naturally, as we discussed before, macroprudential policy or monetary policy through the eyes of interest rates is not, here Marco commented something, Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago negative correlations are a puzzle. Yes, if someone from Venezuela or Trinidad and Tobago is out there, it would be great to learn that. I don't know enough about Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago. I agree with you, it's puzzling, because it's puzzling, or at least it is a puzzle considering the kind of story we are trying to build. In principle, if these two countries, I can't recall right away, if say that these two countries are procyclical on the interest rate side, then what this would mean is that Jamaica and Tobago, Trinidad and Tobago, are using these two instruments as complements to reinforce each other. And this might be something that, depending on the context of the country, might be optimal. Because if you have a huge capital outflow, the kind of interest rate increase that you may need to do in order to ameliorate that capital outflow might be so tough, and depending on the dynamics of reserve requirements and interest rate, one may argue that is like in taxation, it's preferable to increase the tax of two taxes to reduce the average marginal tax burden, as opposed to increase one a lot and keep the other one very small. So why is this going on? If it is because of some kind of complementarity history, or if it is because something is wrong with the data or the way in which things are collected, I wouldn't be right now 100% sure. Even some of the latest problems in the profession in terms of tiny errors here and there, I wouldn't be that brave, but I would say with 99.9% confidence that this graph is correct. Why is this happening, I don't know, but it's a great point. If someone could help us on that at some point and maybe illuminate us with some idea of why this might be going on, it might be great. And again, the other thing is that this is a very short period of time. And when you deal with short periods of time, sometimes you might be averaging the wrong periods because there are two periods and then you're averaging and it looks weird. And that's why at the end of the day, in our second paper, instead of doing this, which is more of a motivation, basic style of facts, what we do is, if I may, more of a structural VARs and input response functions to exploit changes that are quite well identified as opposed to calculate correlations. But you're absolutely correct. It's puzzling, at least in the context of our history, of our story. Naturally, as we discussed before, macroprudential policy, reserve requirements in our case, and interest rate policy are not only the only kind of variables we have. Central banks have to deal with capital flows and exchange rate movements and output volatility. The other one is international reserves, and if something we've learned that, or at least I think we've learned that how many reserves are too many, conceptually speaking, might be just infinite, because it's never enough. In the cases of some sudden reversals, naturally they are costly, particularly for those countries that are in debt in foreign currency and they are paying some debt for that, or some interest rate for that foreign currency debt, but at the same time you have these international reserves that are not giving you that much. But what we see here in terms of basic stylized facts when taking a look at the cyclical behavior of international reserves is that for the majority of the developing countries, the yellow bars, they tend to be positive. And on average, for the developing countries, this relation is positive. So what this shows, and again, this is not surprising, is that in good times, developing countries tend to increase the number of foreign reserves, and in bad times, they sell them. Why do you sell them? Well, precisely because you bought them to smooth and to provide a cushion in the case of a sudden stop or some reversal in capital flows. So in that sense, international reserves is another policy instrument that is used similarly to interest rates to ameliorate the effect of currency depreciations. Because if it wasn't because of this positive relationship, this would mean that in a bad time, you would be buying reserves. And that is not, or not doing anything with reserves. The fact that you are selling reserves in a bad time, which are typically associated with currency depreciations, pressures, it means that you're using foreign reserves to defend your currency as another strategy that complements the interest rate policy. So this has been a little bit of a first part of the report, which is the most important part of the report, to establish some basic stylized facts. And it has been a lot of effort in terms of collecting all this data set. What we did after that, particularly because in this correlations that I articulate through the eyes of causality, we have severe problems of endogeneity because everything is related with everything. So at the same time, I'm trying to use some way of causality, but in reality, everything has to do with everything. So what we did was, and this is part of what we developed in the second part of the report, and it's another paper on its in and on itself. It's a paper where what we did was to focus on 4 Latin American countries, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Mexico. And we took a look at the entire series of reserve requirements. And what we did was to say, okay, here the reserve requirement changed, here the reserve requirement changed, here the reserve requirement changed. In order to, instead of using a typical VAR or structural VAR identification strategy, where the exogeneity of each shock is articulated through the eyes of this Chalecki decomposition or this timing assumption, what we did here was to follow more of a tradition of what happens on taxation policy in fiscal policy. So I guess you all remember this super famous paper of Romer and Romer, where what they did is to take a look at the average marginal income tax rate. They take a look at average marginal income tax rate. They take a look at each change in the legislated tax rate. They go to Congress reports, speeches of the government, newspapers, a bunch of information, and basically what they do is they say, well, this change in tax rate was due to long-term economic growth rate, typical case where a Republican takes office and they want to reduce tax rate because of long-term growth consideration, vis-a-vis, say, an endogenous case where you reduce output just to boost outputs instantaneously for business cycle consideration purposes. And what they do, even though they both look alike, is to take a look at the narratives, to take a look at what people were saying, what policymakers were saying, and they take that as a given. So if it says it's because of long-term growth, it's not related with business cycle, then they mark it as exogenous, and if it is because of countercyclical fiscal policy, they classify this as endogenous. And once they did that, what you do is to use the endogenous cases to understand the fiscal policy reaction function, precisely because are those cases that are informative about that. And in the case of the exogenous cases that are completely unrelated to business cycle considerations, they use those changes to understand the effect on the macroeconomy. So that is a neat way of identifying exogenous variation vis-a-vis learning what is the policy reaction function. So what we did in this paper was something similar. So what we did was to take these 4 Latin American countries, take a look at these changes in reserve requirements, and we had Jorge Puig, who was back then a research assistant in part of his team, and he was working for about 5 or 6 months just trying to understand what was going on behind each of these reserve requirement changes. And basically, after understanding the nature in which most of these reserve requirement changes occur, we came up with a classification where we had what we call endogenous and exogenous business cycle driven reserve requirements. So for example, those, in some cases, when you take a look, and by the way, what we read was IMF reports, central banks reports, BIS reports, newspapers at the time. We were trying to understand what was really going on. Why is that the authorities in these countries changes the reserve requirements one or the other way? And what we learned pretty fastly is that there are few categories that one could build. One is, say, financial liberalization reforms. If you take a look at the way in which reserve requirements moved from the 70s to nowadays, they went from average sometimes from 60-70% through the eyes of Carmen Reinhardt financial repression towards levels of more international levels of 20, 10, something like that. And in many cases, particularly in Latin America during the 90s, it was clear that that was a trend. Many of the changes of reserve requirements was because we wanted to have a more integrated financial system. We want to have a more dynamic financial system. And it was not driven by business cycle considerations. It was driven by, analogous to the Romer case, long-term economic growth. So what we did was to classify these kind of changes together with other kind of changes that were made because of macroprudential purposes, typically liquidity, solvency considerations in the banking system, and we classified all this package as exogenous. And then what we did was to take a look at some others that were endogenous in nature. In some other cases, you read all these documents, and it was clearly clear that what the authority was trying to do is to influence the credit cycle, and through the credit cycle influence the output. And they say that. They say, well, the economy, the market is quite dry, the economy is cooling off, we are getting into a recession, so what we are going to do is to reduce reserve requirements, to increase the lending channel and increase, hopefully, output in the short term. So it was clear that in some cases there were endogenous considerations. Of course, it's a very difficult job, because differently to many other fiscal identification strategies where you have someone in Congress saying, we do this because of this requires more of a judgment call. Sometimes central banks do things and they don't say that explicitly why is that they're doing that, but in many cases they say so, or at least someone who was a very well-informed person at the time articulate why that was happening, and through that we can establish whether it was more of an endogenous or exogenous case. So what we did with that was to basically do another paper, which is the second part of the report, which is the one where I'm going to show you in terms of these policy response functions. So basically, for example, in this slide that says the policy response to a real GDP shock, I know that you might not have perfect foresight, but if you take a look at the second plot, it says change in endogenous reserve requirement. Basically, what we're trying to understand is, given a shock in output, how is that the endogenous reserve requirement changes that we identify through this process respond to that? And in the other slide that I will show you later, which understands or try to understand what are the implications of reserve requirement changes, we use the exogenous ones. And this is a much, much better way of identifying exogenous variation as opposed to putting all of them together and run a structural VAR or an impulse response function using a Cholesky decomposition. And actually in the paper we have a lot of points where we show the relevance of that. Mainly, if you don't do that, you might get the wrong responses. You might get something like an increase in the reserve requirement, increase the credit, and increase output, which is a little bit difficult to swallow. But once you take into account that many of these changes are endogenous and you use exogenous ones, you get the expected results. So we try to push a lot for this identification strategy. The good thing is that even though it was a super difficult job, because it was very time consuming reading all these documents and so on and so forth, I think it was worth the result, because the results you get are completely different. And I'm sorry about this. There was one comment, Oscar Carvalho, theoretically and historically, reserve requirements were induced as collective insurance against systemic liquidity. Can we expect that function to evolve procyclically? In terms of the systemic risk, I'm not going to be able to talk today, but the last part of you are correct, the last part of the report, that this was mostly part of the work of Tito Cordella, they developed a model where the kind of assumption that we had at the very beginning, which was, well, if you behave from a business cycle, credit cycle point of view, in a counter-cyclical manner that should reduce systemic risk, that might not be true. So clearly more work is needed here. And I was not aware about this work, but we will certainly take a look. And the systemic risk vis-a-vis this more theoretical view, where we are trying to understand how policymakers respond to output fluctuations, that may encompass that, and maybe the systemic risk part is something that truly needs to be exploited more. I think that what tends to happen is that on my take. On one hand, theory people understand very nicely the transmission mechanism, and when we get to empirics, we are a little bit in trouble to articulate some of the concepts that are so nicely articulated through theory, but that's just a challenge, and it's more fun to keep doing research. It's a nice challenge, but we haven't addressed that. So that's a limitation. So here what I show you is a little bit of what I've been trying to induce you to digest in terms of how is that the typical policy menu works. So here what we did was to, using the case of these exogenous and exogenous reserve requirement changes, is to have a policy response, to understand the policy response to a real GDP shock. And the policy response is going to be, in the first case, the change in interest rates. In the second plot, the change in endogenous reserve requirements. And the third one is the change in foreign reserves. Trust me, that's what it says there, foreign reserves. So here what you have is that in a good time, and here we are treating positive shocks and negative shocks symmetrically. This is something that we could also work using Jordao. We can use simple response functions in a nonlinear way, but here we have used them symmetrically. In part because we don't have that many reserve requirement changes, because we follow this narrative approach. And here what we have is that typically, let me think through the eyes of, instead of a positive shock, a negative shock, and I'm going to flip the result of the policy responses, because it's the kind of rationale we are more frequently used to think about. So if you have a negative shock in output, which is the opposite of what we do here, because it's a positive shock, interest rate will go up, and that's the procyclical part. If you have a negative shock in output, the flip side of the reserve requirements is that reserve requirements will go down. And in a negative shock of output, reserve requirements will flip and be negative, meaning you sell reserves. So what this plot is saying is that in bad times, the typical policy menu is you increase interest rates, you reduce reserve requirements, and you sell reserves. And the opposite would be true in the case of a positive shock. Okay? Now what happens if you think about a depreciation shock? So here we have pressures towards depreciation. What you do, a typical policy menu response is to increase interest rate, and this is part of our story, try to defend the exchange rate. If you have pressures towards depreciation, you increase interest rates. Reserve requirements do not change. So in that way, even though I try to make a story where depreciations are output are somewhat correlated, on average they are, in terms of depreciations being associated with busts, through the eyes of policy responses that not seem to be symmetric. And in terms of the foreign reserves, when you have pressures towards depreciation, you sell reserves. Okay? And this is in sync with what we saw before, but now better identified through this narratives approach and in a better way, because we're addressing endogeneity concerns. So let me go here actually. How is it we digest this? Well, what we did then was to think about what we call the complementarity of substitutability between monetary policy, reserve requirement policy, and foreign reserve requirement policy. This is not a term that we invented. Camilo Tovar has been also playing around with this concept. I mean, this is a quite established way of thinking about these things. In the same way, on the fiscal side, we tend to think whether taxation policy complements or substitutes government spending policies. So what we found, based on this impulse response function that I just showed you, is that it seems that monetary policy, interest rate policies, and foreign exchange policies are complements in the way that they reinforce each other. That is to say, in a bad time, when you have pressure towards depreciation, central banks in emerging markets tend to increase interest rates to ameliorate the effect on the depreciation, to ameliorate the effect of capital outflows, and at the same time, they sell reserves, because this also allows you not to reduce the pressure on the depreciation. So monetary policy and foreign exchange policy go hand in hand, they're complements. they reinforce each other. Now, when you take a look at what happens with monetary policy and reserve requirements policy, or foreign exchange intervention with reserve requirements for that matter, what you find is that they are substitutes. In other words, in bad times, when you increase interest rates and when you sell reserves, reserve requirements tends to be reduced. Why is that we argue that tends to be reduced? Because in emerging markets, differently to the advanced world, you have two targets that are not correlated to each other. So you need another instrument. Which is this other instrument that gives you that possibility of dealing with fluctuation in business cycles? Is the reserve requirement, is a lending channel. So the reduction in reserve requirements are aiming at doing what monetary policy cannot do. But not cannot do because in an ideal world we wouldn't like it to do, but because given the nature of our economies, sometimes we cannot do. The other thing that came to our, we're thinking about these issues and we're thinking about the policy menu. Of course, there are many other policy menus out there, and this relates to a question that was asked before, we discussed before. One is capital controls. Capital controls through the eyes of the old kind of 1980s capital controls. What we've seen, and some of the countries in the region have, is that to the very least, the effectiveness of capital controls is questionable. They are easy to evade. There are many leakages. If this translates into a very, very high exchange rate premium, then the incentives to do whatever is necessary to get that return are super high. So at best, we tend to think that they are an occasional band-aid. In principle, one would like, from an optimal policy design point of view, maybe to have capital controls to deal with temporary shocks to the capital account and not to put them permanently, because we know that once you put them permanently in the long term, most of the evidence seems to suggest that they're not that effective. The other instrument that is clearly important, and it's part of the other side of the table, is what happens on the fiscal side, right? If you have a sound fiscal policy, you don't have exploding debts, you can truly articulate the short-term flexibility with the long-term sustainability, that will help a lot on not putting pressure on pressures towards depreciation. This will help you to gain policy credibility, and it will alleviate the pressures you have on currency depreciation. That's why we also wanted to start with the fiscal policy, because even though, historically speaking, the region do not have exactly the best credentials, in the last 15, 20 years, depending on who you talk to, but I think that the region has learned a lot in terms of fiscal management. Whether that will be able to be the case 3, 4, 5 years from now, we'll see. Clearly, is as people say in this country, the proof is in the pudding. Here Alberto says, Christine Forbes has a paper that I understand suggests that capital controls could be effective. Yes, they could be effective. In some cases they have. I mean, if one take a historical view, for example, of the capital controls in Chile that were articulated through capital controls on the inflow as opposed to the outflow, they seem to have worked, and this is part of why those kind of capital controls have every now and then being used as a rationale to impose capital controls. That's why I wouldn't say that they do not work, but as we articulate in this slide, the effectiveness is questionable. I think that it's less of an issue, it's more of a debatable issue as opposed to whether pursuing fiscal or countercyclical fiscal policy matters. I think that it's still, I think it depends a lot on how is that you do it, when is that you do it, because naturally if you have a sign and stop process, all of a sudden capital outflows going out, if you attempt to shut down the door, they will jump out of the window and they will go somewhere out. So I think that it also depends on the incentives to leave. But if something, my understanding is that there is no consensus agreement on whether they are fully effectiveness, as opposed to what happens on the fiscal side, which I think most people would agree that if you follow a contracyclical fiscal policy, that is something that is good for your macroeconomic stabilization purposes. So what are the policy lessons of that? Well, how is that we put all this together? Remember, we started talking about fiscal policy, how that procyclicality could amplify the output volatility. Then we moved towards monetary policy and interest rate policy, and how is that the region and many emerging markets, because of their volatile nature, because of their dependence on external factor, they have this huge inflows and outflow that may trigger the undesired response, if one thinks in terms of macroeconomic stabilization purposes, but very well rationalized monetary policy if we think about currency defense, which is to increase interest rates. So maybe, and our paper, like playing with Rastis and with Legos, we add an appendix, which is to say, well, maybe that's the role of macroprudential policy. Maybe that's how emerging markets have been using reserve requirements, precisely as a way of dealing with this problem of two instruments, two targets, and one instrument. This is not a problem that most advanced economies have, and that's why maybe they're not using reserve requirements that much. I know they're using another kind of macroprudential policies, particularly when thinking about the build-up of systemic risk. So at the end of the day, our take, or the take of the report, was to say maybe Fisher and Rajan, they're probably right. Central banks may have no other choice but to defend the currency in times of turmoil. They would have to increase interest rates. And what we add to that is, but key aspect often ignored, is that doing things right during good times, in the case of fiscal policy and repaying debt, will pay off in terms of increasing credibility and reduce vulnerability of currency, domestic and capital outflows. Still, and this is our main point, maybe what is going on here, subject to be still discussed and to do more research, is that precisely macroprudential policies, reserve requirements policies, are still helpful in providing that second instrument. Still, I think that the theoretical channel needs to be a little bit further investigated. But at least based on what we found from an empirical point of view, it seems that that is how emerging markets have been using reserve requirements as a second instrument to deal with contracyclical considerations. And the policy role of foreign exchange market interventions may also be another way of dealing with that. And if something in most of the countries of the region, reserves is not a problem, if I may. We have an important cushion of reserves. But I think that at the end of the day, particularly with dealing with credibility, there is no substitution for having a very solid and well taken care fiscal side. So I think that that's what I had to say here. Paolo had another question. Paolo, David. Pleasure, and I want to thank you again, Alberto and Semla and the Central Bank of Uruguay for hosting this. It has been wonderful and my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Seems that there are some comments there.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. And as Guillermo said it, thank you to Banco Central of Uruguay for hosting us. Next week, we'll have the presentation by Matias Paustian from the Federal Reserve Board. And the week after, we'll have Claudio Borio from BIS. Thank you very much to all, and see you. No sé manejar eso.